That the reason why we set goals is not to see if we can meet them, but to see how far God. So we're in First Kings chapter 2 today as we continue our introduction into the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And we're studying it from the lens of Solomon. We are going to be looking at these books through the eyes of Solomon, the one who God chose to author these books. And at this point, we see that Solomon, who is possibly just about 20 years old, has just barely survived a coup that was led by his older brother Adonijah. His older brother, who had believed that it was his turn to rule as the first possibly surviving son. In those days, the first surviving son was the one who ruled. Why is Solomon, the possibly 7th to the 10th child, having more access to the throne than Adonijah? And so Adonijah decided to take matters into his hands, saying that David, his father, was at this point very old. And he had learned from his brother Absalom, because when Absalom tried to usurp the throne from David, David ran away. And so Adonijah was hoping that the same thing would happen, that David, that is now older, much older at this point, when he sees that I have made myself king, maybe David would run away as well. But David did the opposite. David stood his ground and appointed Solomon to be his successor. And when you read this story from Solomon's perspective, the only reason he has become king is because his father David had helped him. And so in today's chapter, we witness what seems like David's last words. Feels like David is on his deathbed and is giving Solomon his final instruction. And I believe hidden in this conversation may lie the motivation for why Solomon actually wrote the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. It literally just came to me this morning. In this chapter, 1 Kings chapter 2, we also witness a significant transition in the life of Solomon, where he grows from being a boy to becoming a man. Again, we believe that Solomon is around 20 years old at this point, and he has been ushered into a position of national responsibility. He has to grow up fast. We'll also be exploring one of the strangest requests, personally, that I found in the Bible. I remember before studying this chapter, I'd always wondered, Adonijah, you wanted the throne, you didn't get it, and you thought the next best thing would be to ask for Abishag? You want to marry one of David's concubines. That seems strange. But by the time we're done exploring this, you realize it wasn't actually a strange request. There was more to that story. There was more to that request, that experience, to what Adonijah actually did. It was a very subtle strategy that he was imploring. He made a request that would lead to the deaths of not just himself, but Joab. And Abiathar, the high priest or the priest, lost his position based on this request. Why did he request for Abishag? There's a much deeper insight hidden in this part of the story that you won't see coming, I promise you. Also, if you've ever wondered what it means to honor your parents, I'll be sharing a powerful insight from this chapter, because most people, I believe, confuse honor for obedience. We believe that if I'm to honor my parents, then I must obey them. But the Bible actually doesn't say that. And we'll see an example, a prime example here, where even though Solomon honored his mother Bathsheba, he did not obey her request. Practical example is there are a lot of people who say, oh, God has told me this is my spouse, this is who I should get married to, but I need to have my parents' consent before I move on. But before we dive into all that, we're going to analyze David's last conversation with Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 2. So 1 Kings chapter 2, starting from verse 1. And so it says, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. Remember, when we're starting a new chapter, chapters and verses were added to the Bible hundreds of years later from when the original manuscripts were written. And so these manuscripts originally came as one singular story without any partitions, without any breakages. And so for references, for ease of reference, chapters and verses were included. And so what that does, if you don't study the Bible properly, is that we tend to read the Bible in isolation and not as a continuation. So when we get to 1 Kings chapter 2, we'll see it as a brand new story, when in reality, it is the continuation of an existing story. And so when we start in 1 Kings chapter 2, and we see that the time drew near for David to, and he gives a charge to Solomon, his lies, that David at this point was now a lot older than where he was in First Kings chapter 1. In First Kings chapter 1, David already had some health issues that he was battling with, because the Bible says that he could not keep warm even with covers over him. I did a bit of study on that to explain that as an older person, the older we get, the blood circulation begins to decline, right? The effectiveness of our blood circulation begins to decline. And I gave the example of how, my younger kids, we live in Canada. It's cold. They just wear jackets. Like they do. Like I'm all kitted up. They just want to wear hoodies to school, and we're like, you're going to get cold, you're going to get sick. But they don't feel the cold the same way we do, because as young children, their blood circulation is a lot more effective than the older people, right? And so David, at this point, his body's ability to regulate the internal temperature had declined so much that even with blankets, multiple blankets being put over him, he was still shivering. And so that was a description that helped qualify the state of David's health at this point of his life. And because of that, they had to find a young virgin named Abishag, who her character becomes more evident in this chapter, more significant. They had to bring a young virgin to help keep David warm. And so you can imagine, now that it says when the time drew near for David to die, it means that David at this point was already seeing the end of the road. David at this point likely felt extremely fatigued, very weak, tired, probably is experiencing a loss of appetite, because the question I had to ask myself here is, what was David experiencing as he drew near to his death? Because he knew when he called Solomon, he said, I'm about to go the way of the earth. So at some point, David must have realized, I'm about to die. What was that experience like? Had he began to lose his appetite? Had he began to breathe in a certain way, shallow and labored breathing, like he's like, I'm about to go. And so every moment he had, every breath, every word at this point in David's life was extremely important. It's like he was running out of minutes. And so he calls Solomon his successor. Solomon was already king at this point. They were both kings. But it's kind of like how, in organizations today, you have a CEO who is about to leave the company, but there is now an interim CEO. So they are both CEOs at the same time, but this one is about to leave permanently. And so he's calling the interim CEO to say, these are your final instructions before I leave. And so at this point, I'm beginning to think, what was David feeling? What was he thinking? Because at this point, even though David was physically weak, his mental state was still sharp. It reminds me of all these professional footballers, right? It's like your mind still tells you can do it, but your body is like, It's like if you're fast when you're 20s, now that you're in your late 30s, your mind still wants to do what it wants to do, but your body is not picking, is not aligning. David was at that point in his life. He was still mentally sharp, but his body was not in alignment with his mental state. And so as the curtain of his life draws to a close, I'm imagining David reminiscing on his life, processing the defining moments of his life. How did I go from the house of Jesse, being rejected by my father, to being anointed king, to defeating Goliath? It's one thing to be anointed king, it's another thing to become king. It took 13 years. David is going through all this in his mind. The older you get, the more you begin to reminisce, especially when you're getting to the end. One thing that stood out to me was David must have just been imagining, because Saul was king. How did God take me from being a shepherd boy and becoming a king in place of Saul? Saul already had established it, like his family members were supposed to be the ones to succeed him. How did this happen? How did my life end up like this? This is why I don't believe in setting goals. And I've shared this here before, because if you had told David, as was a shepherd boy, what's your goal next year? What's your 5-year goal? What's your 40-year goal? David would never have been able to envision becoming king of Israel. Setting goals are good, and I've shared this here before, that the reason why we set goals is not to see if we can meet them, but to see how far God will exceed them. That is why we set goals. Or you pray to God for him to define what your goal should be. Because when I keep reading stories like this, I'm like, if you are giving David a 1-year plan, where do you think you're going to be in the next 1 year? What do you think David would have said? And it happens with our lives a lot as well. We don't set goals to see if we'll meet them. We set goals to see how far God will exceed them. That even if you set goals, by the end of the year, when you see where God has taken you, you're like, oh my goodness. Now, the glory will be given to God, not to you. Because when you set goals and you meet those goals, you can give yourself the credit. At the beginning of the year, I did New Year's resolution and I was able to meet those goals. That's pride. We set goals to see how far God will exceed them. David, let's even assume we'll be like, man, I want to be like the biggest sheep shearer in the entire Israel. You became king. He's like, oh my goodness, how did God do that? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this clip and you want to know how to hear from God using the Bible, I'd love to invite you to a live Bible study session that is happening every single day, Monday to Friday, 5 to 6 p.m. EST, where I show you how to not just read the Bible for information, but how to meditate on it for revelation, because revelation is the key to your transformation. Take care. Bye-bye.